welcome. Good evening. The Friends of the Public Library, as part of our speaker series, is very excited to host tonight international best-selling author Tess Gerritsen. Tess has written over 31 suspense novels, and her series featuring Detective Jane Rizzoli and medical examiner Maura Isles inspired the hit TV show Rizzoli and Isles. Tess's latest novel, The Spy Coast, which I'm happy to say will be the first in a series, is her latest book, and we have some on display that you can purchase after the talk. So please welcome Tess Gerritsen.
Thank you. Thank you, Marjorie. Thank you for giving me a chance to visit this really nice town. This is a really pretty town. And the weather turned out fine in the end. First of all, how many of you are writers or want to be writers? I mean, there's always a couple, and some of you are too shy to raise your hands. So as I'm getting, I've been at this business for 37 years now, I realized. Because my first book came out in 1987. And as I feel like I'm getting older, I'm really paying more attention to how it all happens. How do you get from an idea to a novel? It's still a mysterious process for me. And every time I sit down to write a new book, I still get hit with this, how did I do it the last time? How did I do it the last 32 times? I mean, I'm now working on my 33rd book, and it's still a mystery to me. But I've learned something over these decades, and I thought I would just, it helps also to know about, where the books come from, but just give you an idea of where the ideas come from and how do I get from an idea to a finished novel. So what I think, things I've learned over the last 3.5 decades, it never gets easier. So I hate to say it, for those of you who want to be writers, your first book may actually be the easiest book you ever write, because there's no expectations, you can take your time, there's no deadlines, you're having fun. And I think that's true for a lot of writers. Their first book was the most fun they ever had, because after that, if you actually sell that book, then all these other things come into play having to do with business. I've also learned that a book that takes you 5 years to write is not necessarily going to be any better than the book that takes you 1 year to write. Sometimes the book that you write the fastest it's like it's your characters are alive, and that may turn out to be your best book. And I've also learned that there is no easy genre. Now, I started off, and some of you may not know this, I started off writing romantic suspense novels. My very first 8 books were with Harlequin intrigue. And the little paperbacks that you used to see at the grocery store, you don't see them there anymore. And I learned from that taking a story that is essentially a man falling in love with a woman, or nowadays it could be anybody falling in love with anybody, and just using that same story again and again and making it new and fresh and creative is really difficult. How many ways can you describe sex, right? It's like, how many ways can you, well, actually, there are many more ways to describe murder. Murder is much easier to write about than sex. So I've learned there's no easy genre. And I've also learned that everybody has their own process. There's no wrong way to write a book. I was told early on, you need to write an outline, you need to have a roadmap, you need to know where your story's going. Nah, it never worked for me. And most of the successful novelists I know who are women, especially women, are very much seat-of-the-pants writers. They don't know what's going to happen from the beginning to the end. I mean, they know if there's a murder, it will be solved. That's about all we know. But you don't necessarily know how you're going to get there. Some people do like to write outlines, and it's a peculiar thing I've noticed that the people who write the most extensive outlines tend to be male attorneys. And I think it's because they're used to having their ducks lined up in a row before they walk into the courtroom. So they do that with their novels as well. So no right way to write a novel, no wrong way to write a novel. The most important thing is that you have to feel excited about this book, about these characters, about this topic, and you start with an idea that somehow grabs you. So how do you know it's a good book? Well, I always say you feel it somewhere in your gut. You hear an idea and you think, oh, and you have an emotional reaction to that idea. My very first big thriller came about because I had a dinner conversation with a retired homicide detective, and he'd been on vacation in Russia. And while he was in Moscow, because he's a cop, he talked to other cops. They seem to like to talk to other cops. And they told him, we have a problem here. We have kids disappearing from the streets of Moscow, and we're convinced these kids are being kidnapped and sent to the Middle East as organ donors, where they're cut open and their organs are removed and the kids are just sacrificed. And I heard that story, and I felt sick because my kids were old enough at that point to be organ donors for adults. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Now, this is another clue. If you can't stop thinking about it, that may be your next book. So the first thing I did was, because I was still writing romance novels at the time, I thought, well, this is not a romance novel, clearly. So I called my brother-in-law, who was a reporter for Newsweek, and he was about to leave for Russia. I told him about this. He got home from Russia and he goes, well, if it's happening, it's the Russian mafia, and there's nothing anybody can do to stop it. So, I tried to do something about it. And since I couldn't do anything about it, I thought, well, I'm still thinking about this, and I'm thinking about kids, and I'm thinking about boys my son's age, 12, and this character came to me, and I realized that was a book. And even though I was writing romantic suspense, I thought, doesn't matter, this is my next book. And that turned into a book called Harvest. It was my first big thriller. It was my first time on the New York Times list. And it's the first time I can really recall having an idea that just hit me so hard emotionally that I knew it was a story. And I think it's that kind of a beginning that turns a book into a success. Because you want to write that book, it won't let you go. So you get ideas from conversations. People tell you something and you go, what? Or you just have this terrible reaction to it, and you know that that's a story. Where do other ideas come from? I read a lot of newspapers. I read a lot of sometimes shady stuff like the National Enquirer, but you never know what you're going to come across. So here's a story that actually came out of the Boston Globe. It was a story that came out of the suburbs. I can't remember which suburb it was, but the story was very brief. It was about a young woman who was found dead in her bathtub. And the police came, and they found empty pill bottles, and it was cold water, and they thought, oh, it's overdose, right? So they zipped her up into a body bag and sent her to the morgue, and a couple of hours later, she woke up in the body bag. So you had that reaction, right? You're all like, that's what you want. There's a story there. So, but what kind of a story? Where does that story go? Well, it depends on what genre you write. Now, if you write horror, what are you going to do? You're going to say that's a vampire, or you're going to say that's a zombie, right? I mean, that's the direction you're going to take it in. If you write like Jason Bourne novels, you're going to say that's the spy Jason Bourne who's faked his death, and this is how he's going to get away, right? But since I was writing at that point Rizzoli and Isles, and I had a medical examiner as one of my heroines, I made it into a thriller for Rizzoli and Isles. And so I used the story where it opens up where Maura's working in the morgue late one night. She hears a noise. She unzipped the body bag, and the corpse's eyes pop open. Right? And so what does she do next? She calls 911. And that corpse ends up in the local emergency room, where the corpse does something nobody expects, kills the security guard, and takes hostages in the hospital. So it became a hostage crisis. That's all I knew. That's all I knew about the story. It's a hostage crisis, and I also knew that one of the hostages was a very pregnant homicide detective named Jane Rizzoli, who was there to have her baby. So she's in her hospital gown. Nobody knows she's a cop. She's stuck in X-ray with this crazy person, with the other hostages, and she's terrified that this person is going to find out she's a policewoman because the security guard just got killed and she might be next. So that's all I had. That was my beginning for a book called Vanish. But it started off because I read the newspaper and thought, oh, that's freaky, right? That's freaky. Another newspaper article I read, and this is the other thing I do, is I have a folder with clippings that I collect over the years, and I don't always know what I'm gonna do with them. Sometimes they sit in that folder for 10 years before I pull it out and I go, oh, now I know what this story is about. So that happened once. I got this article out. I can't remember. It was in the 1990s, I think. And the article was something like, Dugway sheep incident has been declassified by the US military. And this is a story that happened like decades earlier. And I thought, ooh, this sounds interesting. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Dugway sheep incident. Yeah, okay. It happened in a place, and I'm not making this up, called Skull Valley, Utah. And it was a sheep farming community. And this one farmer that evening was feeling very, very ill. So he went to bed early. It was a cold evening. And he woke up the next morning, had a headache, and he walked outside. And his yard was littered with dead birds and dead rodents. And he didn't know what was going on. And as the farmers went out to look at their flocks that day, they found all their sheep were dead. 3,000 sheep died overnight. They called in veterinarians. They couldn't figure out why the sheep were dead. Anyway, it was a mystery. It was a mystery for decades until, as I mentioned, it was declassified. So you get an idea of what happened, right? It turned out that the US military was conducting nerve gas tests. And the wind changed abruptly. And the wind brought this nerve gas into this valley, killed all these sheep. They all died. And that led to this mystery that nobody had solved for decades. So as a writer, and those of you who are writers, you probably have this natural reaction, how do I use this? What could have happened? What's the worst that could have happened? Well, it turned out no people died that night because it was a cold night. And I thought, as a writer, you think, what if it was a warm night and they'd left their windows open and you killed a whole community? What would happen then? You would try and hide this fact. So that turned into a book called Ice Cold, where Mora Isles is in Wyoming. It's the middle of winter. They follow their GPS into oblivion and end up stranded in the snow. And they hike down to this little village that they think they can get shelter. And they find that everybody has disappeared. There's nobody around, but dinner is on the tables. And there are dead canaries in their cages, and everybody's car is there. What happened to these people? So that was inspired by a newspaper article that I had read, decades earlier. But here's the other part of turning ideas into stories. I call it, the formula is 2 + 2 = 5. It's that you get two separate ideas that have nothing to do with each other, you put them together and you have a chemical reaction that's much bigger. So here was the other, that was the two. The other two that I added to this was, I had a GPS catastrophe once. So my husband and I were trying to get to an Airbnb, or no, actually back then it was just a B&B, in upstate New York, and we followed our GPS into a cornfield, because it directed us into the cornfield. So we finally got out. We finally get to the B&B, and I said to the owner, our GPS took us in a crazy way, and he said, "Did you end up in the cornfield too?" So there's some glitch in the GPS. So that was something I thought, okay, well that's interesting. How can GPSs lead us into disaster? And it was that thing plus this thing about the Dugway sheep incident that I put together and turned into a story. So when you never know, when you tear out your little articles and put them in your folder, sometimes the magic is to take this one and put them together and think, how are they going to affect each other? I also find writers are by nature really curious people. We're interested in a lot of different things. And as an example, when I was in college, I was an anthropology major, and I was very, very interested in Egyptology and mummies. So over the years, I had been corresponding with this Egyptologist who has an organization called the Mummy Consortium. And what he does is he tries to arrange a CT scan of every Egyptian mummy that's in the United States. We have about 300 to 500 mummies in the US that got here through various reasons. Sometimes it was museums, but sometimes they came over through private collectors during the Victorian era, and they end up in weird places, like we had one end up in an antique store in Maine. And I think that it was the father of King Ramses the Great ended up in Ripley's Believe It or Not in Niagara Falls. And they didn't realize he was royal until somebody noticed the way the arms were, and he got repatriated back to Egypt when somebody found out. So anyway, this mummy consortium, he called me up one day and said, do you want to come and watch the CT scanning of a mummy? We don't know much about it. Of course, I did. I drove down to Poughkeepsie, and this is the thing. Writers, follow your instincts, follow your curiosity. You don't know what's going to come out of that. So I drove down to Poughkeepsie, helped them put the mummy from the local museum into a white van, and we drove it to the local hospital. And that's where these mummies are often scanned, in the same hospital CT scans that you and I are scanned in. So, yeah, I mean, it was a working hospital, so you're pushing this mummy through the lobby. And so they're taking it to the X-ray department, and they were getting this mummy ready for the scan. And you know, writers also, we love to overhear conversations because we think we're going to use these things, right? So be careful around us. But I found out that it had taken months for this CT scan to be arranged. Now, the museum wanted to do it. The radiologist wanted to do it. The hospital wanted to do it. But the reason it took months was because of one person, the hospital attorney. He said, we have to abide by HIPAA rules. Yes. And we cannot get informed consent for this mummy. So here's what they did. The museum said, we're the parents. So they cited as the parents. And then the next thing that was funny about this whole situation was that, you've all probably had CAT scans, right? Before you can start the program, you have to fill out some patient information on the computer program. Number one, how old is the patient? And the museum said about 2,000 years old. So of course, they didn't take that, so they made it a day old. And then the question was, what is the sex? Is it male? And it turns out that with CAT scan programs, you put male, female, or other. You can have that third choice. And the CAT scans technologist said, please, can we use other? I haven't done that yet. So it went in as a one-day-old other, and as we're watching the CAT scans, and now mummy CAT scans are like from head to toe. You're seeing everything. And they're just cross-sectional x-rays. So you could see that it was a good mummification job. The brain was removed, as is traditional. And if you don't know how that happened, you would punch a hole in the nostril, and they would blend the brain in place. They would liquefy it, and then it would be drained out of that nostril. They get down to, all the organs have been removed and wrapped. But then they got to the thigh, and there was a broken femur. It had not healed. So the question was, and this was the initial feeling, was that maybe this man, turned out to be a man, had an accident just before death, and he bled into his leg, and that's why he ended up dying. But the writer, of course, is always thinking, how do I turn this into something weird? What do I do? And then I thought, well, what if we saw something that nobody was expecting? What if we saw, buried deep in this muscle of this 2,000-year-old mummy, a bullet? Yeah, well, what does that tell you? It's not an ancient mummy. So anyway, that turned into a book called The Keepsake, where Maura Isles is asked to come and watch. She's there to observe the CAT scan of a mummy, sees a bullet and sees something else. She realizes there's modern dental work. And then she calls up Jane Rizzoli, and then it becomes a homicide case for Rizzoli and Isles. So anyway, that's to me, it's just like, play with your hobbies, really embrace your interest, your curiosity, because you just don't know whether that's going to turn into a story. And then sometimes I get stuff out of my own life. And in this case, I'm going to talk about the Spy Coast now, because this is out of my own life. When my husband and I moved to Maine 34 years ago, he opened up a medical practice, and part of getting a new patient, part of taking in a new patient was getting their occupational history. So he would ask his patients, what did you do for a living? Because most of them were retired. We live in an older community. And he would get this answer. I used to work for the government. What did you do for the government? Well, I can't talk about that. So he heard this like 2 or 3 times within a week, and he just thought, who are these people? How did we end up here? So he mentioned it to the local realtor, and she goes, oh, they're all retired CIA. They've all moved up to Mid-Coast Maine. And we found out later that on our little street, we were living in a house then that had maybe 6 houses. There was a retired OSS guy on one side of us, and there was a retired CIA a couple doors down to the other side of us. My son wanted to do a sleepover with a kid he met at school, and I called up the parents to arrange that, and I talked to the dad, and he said something that made me laugh, and I said, oh, you must be one of those retired CIA people. And there was a really long silence on the phone. And the man just said, who have you been talking to? So I was surrounded by them, and I kept thinking, what brought them up here? What is it about Maine that has attracted retired spies? I've heard several explanations. One of them is that it's far from any nuclear targets. Another is that somebody went up there, retired, liked it, and called his friends, and then their friends started showing up. Also because it's a beautiful place. It's a place where you can be anonymous. People are really respectful of your privacy in Maine. If they get the idea you don't want to talk about it, they won't bother you. We leave each other alone. It's kind of that Yankee coolness up there. But then there's something I also found, which is going to turn into my next story after this book, is that we actually had a little satellite operation of the CIA right up there or near where I live. I can tell you which house it was happening in. And if any of you have ever heard of Operation MK, Project MK Ultra, that was what was happening up in Maine. It was happening around the world, but it was weird to think that we had something happening in our little town, which, it's in the middle of nowhere. So that may have been why some of the CIA agents began to come to Maine, because they came up there, they worked on this project, they really fell in love with the area, and they stayed. So I was thinking about retired spies. What do they do? What's their retirement like? Do they have book clubs? Do they go to cocktail parties? Do they get bored? Well, I can tell you what some of them do, and they have done up in Maine, along with we have a lot of retired State Department up there. They started the Camden Conference. If any of you have heard about that, it's an international conference held in a little town of 5,000 that draws speakers from around the world, leaders, journalists, former spies, ambassadors, 5-star generals to come and speak at the Camden Conference every winter. And, you have to really want to come to this to show up in Maine in February. But it's always sold out ahead of time. And that's what retired spies do. They get together and they still have a global perspective. And it makes our town very much richer and much more interesting. So I thought, there's a book here. There's a book here about retired spies, or retired bored spies. And then I get to the next stage, which is, who is my book about? And this is the second thing. So I've been talking about the idea, and now we come down to your character. And I've seen people say, well, I always write a complete character sketch. I have a whole biographical, sheets and sheets about who my character is. I've never done that. And every time I've done that, I feel like I've killed my character because they become so boring. They become like a college biography, So I like to develop characters the way I meet people. When I first meet you, I know a couple things about you. I know your gender, I know your race, I know how old you are. And once you open your mouth, I can tell a lot about you, your accent, your educational bit, what vocabulary you use, your emotions, but that's all I know. And then as I get to know you over months and months and months, you become more real to me. I get to figure out who you are as a person. And that's the way fictional characters are too. So when I start off, all I know is a little bit about my characters, and then they reveal themselves to me. So I don't feel the need to write a character sketch, because that's going to happen very organically as you see what these people are doing. The other thing that's a trick for me, if you're having trouble getting started, listen to the voice of your character. And it sounds a little bit psychotic, but I really am listening for the voice. I'm trying to hear what they sound like. And you can tell a lot by a person by the tone of their voice. Like when I go back to Harvest, it was the voice of a 12-year-old boy talking to me that got that book started. And with this one, it was the voice of a 60-year-old woman who says to me, I'm not the woman I used to be. Sort of a weary voice. And then the story kind of opened up, because then I thought, who did you used to be, Maggie Bird? Tell me. And then that helped me write that story. So Maggie Bird, as you know, is a 60-year-old retired spy. And she's haunted. There's something very troubling in her past. She has fled CIA. She's living in a little town in Maine. She's now raising chickens, selling the eggs at the local farmer's market, doesn't talk about her past. She has a neighbor she trusts. She has a circle of friends she has martinis with, because let me tell you, spies all drink a lot. Everything seems like, all you know about Maggie is that a fox is killing her chickens. This is the first scene with her. Fox is killing her chickens. She grabs her rifle and she shoots that fox and gets it with one shot. So how many 60-year-old women are able to do that? I mean, I'm sure there are a few, but the fact she does that, I don't even tell you she's a spy. I just tell you that she shoots the fox with one shot. And that's all you need to know at the beginning, right? Why does this woman have why is she such a good shot? And then you find out later on, when a dead body shows up on her driveway, that she is curiously unrattled by the whole thing, even though she understands what the meaning of this is. And this is the other part of character development, is how do they behave around other people and how do other people see them? So I introduce a female police chief who's only in her 30s. She's a young woman. Her name is Jo Thibodeau, very, very common name up in Maine. And so she's here to see about this dead body in the driveway that has been reported by the FedEx guy who saw it as he was delivering stuff. So she meets Maggie Bird, the 60-year-old woman, and thinks, oh, poor grandma, she's going to be upset, right? Well, grandma's very, very cool about this. And then Jo notices there's a surveillance camera over the front door, and she figures, well, I need to see your video. I need to see if we caught something. And so Maggie is forced to show the cops her video. But she goes in to open up her computer to show her the system. And, you're expecting like a little Ring camera, right? She looks at the computer and realizes, oh my God, this is a multi-channel security system. There are cameras everywhere on this property. Who is this woman? So anyway, it's that discovery, that conflict between these two women that really I was having so much fun with, because it's young versus old. It's local versus somebody who's lived abroad and is very sophisticated. And I think that conflict is what really drew me into the story. Because the other thing that I was working on is that as I get older, I'm much more aware of how we disappear, especially women. I think as women get gray hair, we disappear and nobody pays attention to us anymore. They don't think we know anything. Oh, sweet little granny, can you show me your Ring camera? Oh my God, you've got a 12-camera security system, what's going on? So I wanted to show you that, old people, we don't necessarily lose it. In fact, we have a lot of experience that young people should probably be listening to. And that was the other theme about this, is that these 5 retired CIA people who range from 60 to 75 have not lost it. They are still there to help the local police chief, who still can't figure out who these people are and why they're always ahead of her. So that was the other reason to write this book. And when I finished it, I thought, okay, this was fun. Here's my book. And the next thing I hear is, where's the sequel? So they wanted a second book, and I just finished it. And it will be called The Summer Guests. It will be out next March. And it's about my same 5 spies and the local police chief as they get together to solve another crime. And what time is it? Okay. I'm just trying to think of, I should start asking questions. I mean, you should start asking questions. I know some of you are interested in Rizzoli Isles. You watch that, right? It's still playing in syndication overseas. That's what I hear. I have a couple things in development. Amazon Studios has bought the TV rights for Spy Coast. It's under development now, and it's being developed by the same showrunners who wrote, oh God, it's terrible. I forgot the name of it. It's on Peacock Channel. It's Poker Face. So they're writing the pilot episode. And that's where we are now. Any questions?
So do the neighbors have you on watch?
You know, when I went on, I did a book signing in Mid-Coast, and I got a lot more stories. People would come up to me to tell me about it. Because, you know, that first wave of spies that came up to Maine, a lot of them are passing away. They were older. But their children have stories about what Dad did. And they tell me funny things. Like there was one who said, yeah, there was a guy at the yacht club. We didn't realize he was CIA until he got Alzheimer's, and now he won't stop talking about it. There are also things, I mean, people actually, they're very tickled by the fact that our community is being written about. And somebody wrote a letter to the editor about the book and said, to our local newspaper, and said, I just want to share what one of my CIA contacts said, that there are like 3 levels of spies. They're the ones that aren't so smart, that didn't do very well, and they all retired to Florida. And then he said, then there are the middling spies, and they retired to Virginia, but the cream of the crop ended up in Maine. So, yeah.
But something you just said just did a little, light bulb moment for me. I'm not a writer, but maybe you can include something about it in your future. Imagine a retired spy in Alzheimer's nursing home. And the government has to have a special one just so that he was. I just think that could go somewhere.
Well, you're not far off, because a friend of mine is actually working on that story. He was telling me, he says, they must have nursing homes just for spies, right? So they can't share. And he goes, and what if they have Alzheimer's but they make an escape? So I just said, write that book, because that's going to be a killer book. It's great idea. Yeah.
You were just talking about Rizzoli and Adams. How much interaction did you have when they were making the original series?
They were very gracious. I mean, it's the usual thing is that writers, nobody wants the novelist on the set because we're just a pain in the ass. But they were really nice to me. They asked if I wanted to come in and help them develop stories, but I had book deadlines and I couldn't. So I didn't, and the only stories of mine that they actually used was the pilot episode, which was based on The Apprentice. And they did an episode that was based on one of my short stories called John Doe, where Maura goes on a date and she wakes up with no memory of the night and the guy's dead. So, it was the greatest gig I could have gotten, because I got paid to be a consultant and they never consulted me. Right? So I just kept collecting the checks, and they never bothered me. And then in the final season, they said, "Do you want to be on the show?" And I said, "So who am I going to play?" And they said, "Yourself." And they'd written a whole episode about a writers' conference where Jane and Maura get to go meet the famous author Tess Gerritsen. So I really did play myself, but standing there on camera, meeting my characters in the flesh was...
That's funny.
Yeah, it was very strange, but it was a lot of fun. I got an idea of how hard a job it is to be an actor, to say the same lines again and again and again as they do the different camera shots. I would be I would be bored after a while, but they managed to keep up that energy. Yeah.
So the characters are different in the TV
Yes,
books.
they are.
You have no input into that.
No,
They use your names.
Yeah.
They just do their own thing. completely?
They take the books and they adapt them the way they think they will sell. And they did a couple of smart. There are things that I wish they had kept. I like the darkness of the books, but they didn't. They wanted to go light. And they wanted to go funny. And that was great. And they wanted to go glamorous, which I've had a trouble with because I have really not met too many medical examiners who look like Sasha Alexander, right? Or too many homicide cops who look like Jane Rizzoli. But obviously it worked. People loved those stars, and it went on for 7 seasons. Which once a television show surpasses 100 episodes, then it becomes a much more valuable property because it goes into syndication. Yeah. Yeah.
You said every book you write is different. Some are hard, some are a little easier.
Yeah.
Here's my question. When you start writing a book, I know the time frame is different to finish. Do you know where you're headed every time?
No.
The story develop as you're writing.
Okay, I have a perfect example for how undeveloped they are. Okay, I told you about the corpse who wakes up in the morgue, right? Okay, so I started writing that book, Vanish, and the first draft, it's a man in the body bag. Man wakes up, man takes hostages, man terrorizes hospital. And then, the FBI comes in, anyway, it becomes a hostage crisis. And Jane's there. And it seems like this is really exciting. It should be exciting. And I stopped writing about halfway through because I was bored. And I just said, I don't know what happens next. I don't know why he's doing these things. Maybe there's no interesting explanation. Maybe this is a dead end. So this is what I call plot block. It's not writer's block, it's plot block. You don't know what happens next, or you don't know why the characters are doing what they're doing. And I had both problems. So what I find helps is to go on long drives. And it turned out that I had to go do a book signing in Texas, and it involved a 4-hour drive through really boring territory, which is good. You want a boring drive. And somewhere on that drive, it occurred to me why I was bored. Because think about it. Who takes hostages in this world? It's men. It's all these men. So this is like, okay, this happens all the time. What's the big deal? And then on that drive, I thought, but what if it was a woman? Oh, that's interesting. Because now I have different reasons why she would do that. It's not that she's crazy, it's that she's terrified. And then I got home and the book kind of wrote itself. But here's the other thing I do. I don't go back to fix things. I just pretended it had always been that way, and I just kept on writing. Because if you go back to fix things or edit, you will slow yourself down. You will end up you'll just end up getting in the way of yourself. So I just finished the book, and then on the next draft, I went and fixed everything. Then the man became a woman. So if you were to read my first drafts, you'd be very confused. All of a sudden he had a sex change operation, and now he's a female. So that's the other clue I say to writers is I think it helps never to rewrite while you're doing your first draft. You finish that first draft, and then you know what your story's about, and then you can go back and then you can rewrite with an idea of how the whole thing should look. My rewrites, I probably go through 6-7 drafts before I feel it's ready to show to my agent. Anyway, I did not know, and I did not, until I turned it into a woman, then I got an idea about what the story was about and why the hostages were taken. And very often, I'm trying to think about which book I had, where I don't know who the killer is until maybe 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through the story, because you're just setting it up, and you just know who the cast of characters are, but you don't necessarily know who did it.
So you can't wait to see the ending either.
No, and I think it helps, because if you don't know what happens next, it's more likely your readers won't figure it out either. Yeah.
How about your research about technology? You have acknowledgments where there are people that you draw on. When you first started writing, you didn't have the reputation to ask people.
Yes, right.
So can you talk about the evolution of the hard facts of modern?
That's a good question, because it's, really, I'm a very shy person, and I hate to ask people for favors. It's the most difficult thing in the world to pick up the phone and ask an expert, can you help me, please? You're right, I couldn't, but it's amazing to me over the years to find out, even when I wasn't known, how much people love to talk about their jobs. So my very first, it was my very first book. I had no reputation. I was writing romantic suspense, and I needed to have a body burned beyond recognition. Okay. So I thought, who would know the answer to that? I called the fire. I was living in Honolulu at the time. I called the Honolulu fire chief. And I said, I'm writing a book and I need to burn a body beyond recognition. And he was so happy to help me. He goes, yeah, he says, I would put it in a car, roll up the windows and use methanol because that will burn it really, really badly. But he said, you know what? He said, what you're better off doing is taking it to a pig farm. Because a pig farm, take it to the pigs. The pigs, unless they have an artificial hip or metal in their bodies, the pigs will eat, well, they will destroy everything. That body will disappear. I got that out of a fire chief, right? He didn't know who I was. And once I had to ask somebody, how do I pick a lock? So I called a locksmith and they told me. But sometimes you need really and truly difficult technical information. You have to call somebody who is going to give that to you. And the story I have, okay, so I told you I was an anthropology major, which means that I see the world as various cultures. I think people have tribes. Everybody has a tribe they belong to. So I wrote this book called Gravity about the International Space Station. It's actually one of my favorite books, even though nobody bought this book. Of all my books, it had the fewest sales, but it's still one of my favorites. Anyway, it's about the space program. It's about astronauts. It's about living aboard ISS and what is it like to be an astronaut? How do you cause, what would cause a disaster aboard the shuttle? So I had to call NASA. And I called up the Johnson Space Center PR office, and I was scared, okay? I was shaking because I didn't know if I was just, I don't know why I was shaking. It's kind of stupid, isn't it? The worst they can say is no. So I talked to this wonderful guy, and I said, hi, I'm a thriller novelist. I'm writing a book about a biological disaster aboard ISS. Can you help me? And he said, okay, well, tell me what your book is about. And I said, well, this disease takes over ISS and it kills all the astronauts except one person. And he said, what else happens in your book? And I said, well, and this, I had known this much far, a shuttle crashes on landing, killing everybody aboard. I need to know how to make that happen. And he said, do you know what the purpose of my office is here? He says, I am here to make my organization look good. So I'm not sure I want to cooperate. And I said, wait. Everything that goes wrong is not your fault. NASA is the hero here. NASA does everything right. And he said, well, whose fault is it? And I said, it's the military's. And he said, when would you like to come? So what I had learned from being an anthropologist is that tribes are very tribal. And that people who go into the space program because of the civilian space program like NASA, a lot of them do it because they watch Star Trek. They think of space as being for all mankind, whereas the military, it's for our killer satellites and nobody else's, right? So, and there's always this fight for money. NASA is fighting the Air Force. We want these funds. So they don't necessarily get along with each other. And I luckily was able to figure out that before I called JSC. And then when I got to Johnson Space Center, because he invited me to go there for a whole week and gave me interviews with everybody I needed to talk to. And sure enough, you drive into that NASA that NASA parking lot, and you see the bumper stickers I was expecting to see. Beam me up, Scotty. You know that these are Star Trek people. So that was. You have to be able to first of all approach them in a way that makes them feel like, you value them, but you're not gonna screw them. That was the one thing I was going to tell him. I'm not going to screw your reputation. You guys are going to come off as heroes, and they did in the story. The other thing is when you do your research, what are you looking for? What are you going to ask? Now, I had some specific stuff. I needed to find out what could go wrong that would make a shuttle crash. On landing, but I was very specific. I said, I need to have a shuttle crash in such a way that it happens late in the landing cycle so that the bodies are still intact for an autopsy scene that I need to do afterwards. That was technically something that I was actually able to find out because they told me things that made it work. But you're really there, besides your little technical stuff, you're really there to capture emotional details. Yeah, it's nice to know what color the carpet is in the press room, but it's more important to know things that bother you, that really freak you out, because that goes in the book. As an example, I found out that they have range safety officers in Cape Canaveral. And these guys, these women too, they're Air Force officers. They sit in a concrete bunker, and every time a shuttle takes off, when it used to take off, if the shuttle were to have a malfunction and not go over the water as it's supposed to, but started going over towards a populated area, their job was to blow up the shuttle with everybody aboard. So that freaked me out. So it went in the book, you know. So you find things that, and you know, things like, what is it like to do a spacewalk? Well, you can go through all the technical stuff of it, but where you're really trying to pull out the emotional aspect of what is it like to step out of a shuttle, see the Earth way below you, and we are mammals, we're afraid of falling. What is it like to overcome that fear? You know, so you're looking for all the emotional stuff. So that's what I really try for when I do my my research. It's not just technical. You have to make that technical stuff human. Yeah.
Question, do you draw any inspiration or ideas from other authors? In other words, when you talked about Harris, think of Robin Cook, espionage, thrillers, Joe Finder, like that.
Yeah.
Do you ever draw from them at all?
I can't think of any particular instance when I have. I mean, I read a lot of them are my friends. Like I know Joe Finder pretty well. And I think we all just sort of go our own way. But as I said, 5 of us novelists can hear about that corpse waking up in the morgue, and we're all going to go in different directions with, what happens next. Yeah. Yes?
Do you ever scan yourself?
Huh.
Some of these things are so scary, you wake up at night and say,
I get asked that question a lot. What's funny is that writing scary scenes is a little bit like trying to tickle yourself. You can't do it because you're in control and you know where your fingers are going. There's only one time I really scared myself, and that was when something occurred to me in the middle of writing, and I thought, and that was in The Surgeon, where my main character is in the car, and she has a car phone. This book was written in 2001. She has a car phone, and she's realizing as she's talking on the car phone or hanging it up that she was not the last person to have called from that phone. And she realizes that she's not alone in her car. Yeah, so as I was writing that, I thought, oh my God. But that's the only time I recall scaring myself. Yeah. Is there a question over here? Yeah.
Well, you mentioned being an anthropologist, but your first career was not as a writer, really.
I'm a medical doctor. Yeah.
So did you always know you were going to be a writer, or did there?
I always knew I was going to be a writer. I told my dad when I was 7 I was going to be a writer, and he said, "It's no way to make a living." So, and that's how I ended up in medical school. And I think it's an Asian immigrant kind of an attitude. That's why there are so many Asian American doctors, and engineers and lawyers. It's because their parents all told them the same thing my parents did. I think it's a first generation thing. By the time you get to the 3rd generation, they're just like doing whatever they want to do. But the first generation, 2nd generation, it's daddy and mommy telling you, you're not going to survive. Yeah.
And then you finally got to a point where it was just.
I finished I worked as a doctor for about 5 years. I started writing in earnest when I was home on maternity leave. And I had, my babies were really good sleepers. So I put them down for a nap. They would sleep for 2.5 hours, and I could get a page or 2 done. So that was when I wrote my first book. And I always tell my kids, I owe my career to you being a good sleeper. And they still are. So, yes, okay.
When did you stop practicing then?
I stopped practicing when I moved to Maine in 1990. I did not get my Maine license. I thought, by then I had sold 2 romance novels. And, those romance novels, they were never going to pay for my kids' college, but I was having a great time. And I thought, I can keep at this if I just, establish a schedule. And I think the romance fiction market, first of all, it's one of the biggest fiction markets, biggest segments of fiction. And also, I learned a lot. I learned a lot about, because romance is all about character. It's all about developing character. And then you learn about the business. You learn about deadlines. You learn about contracts. So it was a really good place for me to learn. And I found out that a lot of the top female thriller writers now all started in romance. So, Tammy Hogue, Lisa Gardner, Janet, Nora Roberts, yeah. So a lot of them started off in romance. Yeah, Catherine Coulter, right.
What about foreign writers now, detective, or whom are you reading?
Who am I reading right now? I just read, oh gosh, what's her name? This is trouble. I don't remember titles. I don't remember. I get a lot of free books. And one book I read recently, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the title or the author, but it's a British book. It's coming out next year, and it's about a forensic entomologist. She's a bug lady. They call her the bug lady. And the details about bugs in there were so weird. I mean, I didn't know all this stuff about bugs. We all know about larvae, right? We all know about flies and that. But her thing is she's very specific about different kinds of bugs. So I thought that was really interesting. But I wish I could remember because. And I love, I have a couple of authors I really like. I like Lisa Gardner. I love Lisa Gardner. I like Lisa Unger. She turns out a book about every year. Lisa Scottolini, they're all Lisas. Yeah.
Reasons why you like them.
Reasons, they're very emotional writers. The trick of grabbing your audience is not just that there's action. In fact, I find action boring personally on the page. What I like is tension. I like conflict between people, but I'm not talking about like all and out wars. I'm talking about the little tensions that we have every day, right? Those are the things that irritate you. That actually makes you want to read the story. And I always come up with this one thing that irritated me with my late mother. So I was there in San Diego to do a book signing, and I came out dressed, and I was spending the night with her. Came out in my cute little St. John dress, right? I mean, that was an expensive outfit. And my mom takes one look at me, and she goes, "Your skirt's too short." Okay, I'm 50 years old at that point. "Your skirt's too short." And I said, "No, this is a very expensive dress." And she goes, "Well, I really think you should try and dress the way Laura Bush dresses." And it was just one of these comments. It's like, you can be 50 years old and your mom could be 75, but you are still at it. So it's that kind of a tension that, I think it's fun to read. And I think it's true also, my books are not, everybody thinks my books are violent, but they really aren't because they don't show much violence on the page. I show what happens after the violence has happened in the autopsy room. So it's not that I'm showing action, and as I said, I find action boring. And I came to this conclusion by watching a James Bond film. I can't remember which one it was. I remember it was Casino Royale. It was, it starts off, how James Bond always has these cold opens where they have chases and car chases, and it's really exciting. And I'm just kind of, can we get over with the cold open now so we can get to the story? I found that the one scene in that movie that was most riveting to me was a scene on a train between James and the female, and they're just exchanging little barbs, talking. I was fully engaged in that, and as soon as the car chases start, not interesting. I don't know whether that's a male-female thing. Maybe women are more interested in conversation, and the men are more interested in the gunplay. But it's just the way I read. So okay, one last question.
When you're doing research and are asking questions, do you ever get weirded out when you're asking, and like the fire chief, and asking, and he says, "Oh, instead of the car,
go to the pig farm."
Or when you call NASA and you're asking, "How do I do this?" and they're not thinking, should I refer her to the FBI? You know, does it ever weird you out, I guess?
Well, I suppose that, they must wonder. And in fact, okay, after 9/11, a lot of stuff shut down. So NASA took a lot of stuff off its website because of security reasons. And I think the FBI stopped being as cooperative as they were with writers. And in fact, a lot of the FBI buildings were, under lock and key. You couldn't even go into them. So I think things have changed since 9/11. But yeah, I'm sure a lot of writers are on watch lists because you should look at our bookshelves. We have all these books on bombs, building bombs and things, and bioterrorism, and yeah, we're probably under surveillance. I don't know. But yeah, or by my neighbors, right? Anyway, if I'd be happy to sign any books, as I said, my next book is called The Summer Guests. It's the sequel to The Spy Coast, and it will be out next spring. Thank you.